Welcome back to the Sales Pulse podcast. I'm Marla Koupal, the Sales Conversation Architect. For the past 4 weeks, I've been talking about some very normal things that experienced sellers do, and those things that sometimes work quietly against the sale. I call it a revenue leak. After selling for a while, many of you in sales get comfortable, and you may start treating each buyer as a generic buyer and using your generic responses. One of the things that we've talked about over the past few weeks is when the seller gets ahead of the buyer's thinking and filling in the silence and not allowing the buyer to pause. If you could do that, then you'll diminish the buyer's opportunity to just blow you off and ignore you because you're ignoring them. We've also talked about your best sales answers, those things that you just love delivering because they sound so good, they're so compact, they're well practiced. But those may also cost you a buyer. And we've talked about the filters that you develop after years of selling. You hear people the same way when they say the same typical phrases. You feel that you're recognizing patterns, but sometimes you can quickly misread or assume too much to the detriment of your sale. After reviewing those 4 podcasts and those 4 sales habits, I want to continue this week and giving you some more, because it's these habits for those of you who are experienced that really need a review. If selling is feeling stale for you, then this information may be something that you want to take to heart and really start your self-observation process. Many of your habits have come from things that you were taught to do. It was the old selling style. Like, you're good. You'll always answer someone's question, and you know your product forwards and backwards. You recognize the typical buyer problems. You know how to explain value, but do you know how to explain it in the context of the buyer? And you know how to keep conversations moving. However, those problems that you might be having also start with those same skills. If you're so automated, then you may be leaving out the buyer. You don't hear their tonal shifts. You're not working from their attitude shifts. Buyers are not generic. Sellers can have a tendency to respond from what they know instead of what the buyer is telling you and what the buyer does not know. Those are different areas to keep you fresh and alive in a sales conversation and not repetitive, redundant, and boring for your own self. Let's talk about those times that you've heard the words, but you did not hear the buyer. Before we go any, hit that subscribe button so that you'll be notified the next time I go live. Over the next 4 weeks, we're going to look at more of those sales habits that appear to be perfectly reasonable to you, yet they don't get the sale. They don't generate a great conversation, and they don't generate an easy follow-up. We all know how to listen, and we all know that hearing is not listening. When we hear, we're looking for more layers of emotion, intent, and conditions that the buyer might be carrying with them. No matter how good of a listener you are, no matter how well you hear what someone says, your problems will always lie in your interpretation of what someone's telling you. It's how you categorize what people say and how you connect it back with previous buyers or previous situations that will get you into trouble. All those mistakes can happen in a nanosecond. For instance, when the buyer says, "I've already tried a couple of programs," how many of you already have an answer for that? You might be hearing they've tried competitors. So you start talking about why your program is different or better. Well, on a scale of 1 to 10 here, how large was your assumption when you had that thought? I'd say you're at a 10. That statement, tried a couple of programs, does not tell you anyone's state of mind, their intent for the conversation, or even any emotional debris that they're carrying with them. They may be disappointed. They may be happy. What we don't know is how they feel after making those two choices and not following through with whatever program they bought. There's so much hidden within that sentence. Don't go to your program is better mode. You're most likely going to lose that sale or work really, really hard to find the track on which you can generate a collaboration with your buyer. Maybe they're telling you very politely, don't give me another sales presentation. And if you don't ask what happened about those other two programs, you're going to be about as excited as a new puppy getting on a leash and going for its first walk. Your seller's brain loves to finish the story, but stop. It's the buyer's story, so be sure you tune into that. The habit that you might have in which you make those assumptions and those leaps as to what someone means when they just make a statement is what is leaking revenue for you. You need the buyer to give you context. So when you allow them to give you the context by asking simple questions, then you're going to discover their history, the pressure that they're speaking to you with to get something resolved. You're going to hear their satisfaction or dissatisfaction with previous decisions. You're going to hear about their unhappiness, expectations met, expectations not met. They're going to be making comparisons. And you don't know if they're hiding a fear of making another bad decision or the joy of finally finding something new. The first answer that you are habitually giving is not the answer needed. It's simply where the buyer is starting. In my Qualified Buyer Revenue Leak Guide, I ask sellers to follow the buyer's thinking instead of immediately responding to the buyer's information. This distinction matters more than any experience that you've ever had. Always the buyer's in control. So let's take a look again at what they said. I've already tried a couple of programs. Well, what would happen if you simply asked, what was your experience with those programs? They could tell you that it was good information, but they could also tell you why it was hard to implement. They could also tell you why they weren't inspired by it. They could tell you anything. You want to be listening for the emotion, the facts, and the intent that the buyer is there with. And be ready to qualify any or all of those or ask another question. Like, well, tell me how that was for you. Or maybe the buyer will say, they were actually pretty good programs. I just didn't do much with what I learned. Meaning they didn't implement. Now your conversation has another track. It's like, well, what would it take for you to implement something that you thought was valuable? How are you thinking this time might be different? Help them think it through. That's going to make them a more solid buyer in the end. These are completely different sales conversations from the same statement. So it depends on the question you ask to follow up with their statement to get you where you want to go. Whatever their situation is, you take 3 minutes and you delve into that with more questions. You're going to find yourself with a better idea of where your conversation can go and why that program didn't work for them or why they chose not to use it. And that's certainly going to set you up with a better conversation about what you have to offer. People don't like to buy generics. They like to buy what fits them. So now you have the background, and now you know your program, and now you help them see if it's a fit. Sometimes buyers say things that feel very, very obvious. You hook on one word, but that's not the most important word. If a buyer says, I really need to get my sales more consistent, sounds like maybe an easy response if you're a sales coach. You hear sales consistency. So you start out with questions like, how many leads are you getting? What is your closing rate? What are you doing to follow up? They're reasonable questions. They're all fact-based. There's really no emotions in any of those, so that you know if they're having a mental block around sales or if it's just a functional situation. If you're asking all of those questions, you're assuming that sales was what needed your attention. But maybe it was when they said, I need to be more consistent. Maybe you need to find out what's driving that need. Why now? Has anything changed where you were more consistent before than you are now? What's going on? The words don't always deliver the message. Only your questions are going to get you there. This is what I mean when I talk about listening to the buyer instead of simply listening to the words. And when we've been in sales a while, it's easy to make an assumption about what they meant because we've experienced so many previous conversations in which there are similarities. But in each sales conversation, let the buyer rise to the top, just like cream rises to the top on milk. Let them direct and guide you, and always trust that what you're hearing is fresh and new, and you're going to have some fresh and new responses to their tones, to their hesitations, to the things that they repeat, or the details that seem oddly specific. Sometimes they dismiss things. You've heard those statements where they say, it's probably nothing. I always want to hear what comes after that. Or somebody say, oh, this may sound silly. Keep listening. You're going to get the good nugget here to help them move forward. When buyers say things like this, they're showing you where the energy of the conversation will flow. Too often, sellers don't hear any of these because they've decided what the problem is, and it shuts the conversation down. This is where last week's dirty filter conversation matters. The longer you sell, the more buyer patterns you recognize. That's valuable. Recognizing patterns always helps bring cohesiveness to conversations. Yet the danger comes when recognition becomes the conclusion. You've heard, I need to think about it before. You've heard, it's more than I expected. You've also heard, I need to talk to my spouse, or I'm comparing a few options. And your brain has a file folder for every one of them. Price objection, a stall, a decision maker, a competition. Except those are your labels. They aren't necessarily the buyer's meaning. Two buyers can say exactly the same thing and mean two completely different things. That's why I keep saying this over and over again. You may recognize the problem, you still don't know their version of the problem. The seller who forgets that starts selling to the category. And the seller who remembers it keeps talking to the person. When you miss things like this, it becomes a revenue issue, not just a communication issue. When the seller decides too quickly what the buyer means and needs, the conversation starts moving in the wrong direction. The seller starts explaining something the buyer didn't ask about. The buyers will listen politely. The seller will see that the buyer is listening and assume the explanation is working. Sometimes you might be selling a little more. You might be explaining a little more, telling a little story. But notice the buyer's answers get a little shorter and a little shorter, and you, the seller, can feel the energy dropping. If you're trying to rescue that conversation by throwing in more proof, more reassurance, maybe a discount, maybe another testimonial, and you don't know why you lost the sale, it was because the conversation stopped following the buyer's thinking. And neither of you, buyer or seller, necessarily noticed when it happened. This is one of the ways, one of the quiet ways that a sale slips away and just never happens. You don't need 15 new listening techniques to fix this. You need enough curiosity to resist finishing the buyer's thought for them. When something catches your attention, stay there for another question. You're not trying to steer the buyer toward the answer you want. You're trying to understand the answer that they just gave you and find the conversation that will suit them. There is a difference. This week, I want you to notice your sales conversations. Listen for the moment your brain says, I know what they mean. That's your cue to say, I need to ask more. Stay curious for one more answer, one more piece of information, one more feeling, one more emotion, one more intention. Don't let your experience answer the question before the buyer does. The information you need to help this buyer make a decision may be sitting one question deeper than where you normally stop. Until next week, think about the sales habits you have that decrease your sales, or send me your comments to let me know what you're noticing about your sales conversations. Remember, the seller owns the conversation, the buyer owns the decision. I'm Marla Koupal, the Sales Conversation Architect. I'll see you next time on the Sales Pulse podcast on YouTube, Apple, or Spotify.